Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog, Radical Engagement Series. And today we finish off Nicolas Villareal's When Science is Abandoned, The Flower Withers, a review of For Marxism. The first part was dedicated to his breakdown of Comrade Hamilton's use of Althusser and some misunderstandings Nico thought was there, as well as the proposition that Marxist normativity does not trump or change a Marxian commitment to the scientificity of historical materialism. Now, there are some specific, very minor quibbles I had with Nico's argument. But I do think ultimately he's correct that the normative claims of Marxism and the scientific claims of Marxism, that content's kind of separate and necessarily has to be. You can't conflate them. And you can't deal with the normative just by like changes in particular vocabulary and moral implications. There has to be a lot more there. But now he's dealing with the Jacobin epistemology, aka G.A. Cohen's version of analytic Marxism. So let's get into this part, and we'll finish the essay today. You can find this essay in the show notes. It's at this point that Ben Burgess interjects with some praise for analytical Marxism. This tendency of Marxism is diverse, but as he says, it has its origins in J.A. Cohen's 1979 book, Karl Marx's Theory of History. I actually disagree. I do not think it has its origins in that. I think it has its origins in Romer and a few people before G.A. Cohen, but its popularity and most popular manifestation was G.A. Cohen's Karl Marx's Theory of History. I've read some of Cohen's work in college, philosophy class on freedom, the only philosophy course that I ended up taking, where his essays were included alongside those of Hayek as well as others. It wasn't bad, and I also amused myself watching a number of Cohen impressions of famous historical figures on YouTube. It's pretty funny. You should go find it. It did strike me that Cohen's essay contained nothing particularly Marxist, however. I think it's mostly Whiggish history. As for Burgess, he finds the following aspects of Cohen as being worthy of praise. A, his insistence that it's useful to reframe and clarify Marx's insights in language quite different from Marx's own, often Hegel-infused terminology, although he sneaks a lot of stuff in, and there's a really good book on that I do think people should read. I would go through Tom Clark, Judging the Analytic Marxists by Their Own Criterion. Is it Tom Clark? Hold on. Not Tom Clark. I was mixing up Simon Clark and Tom Mayer. I have to take the L on that one. Tom Mayer's book on analytical Marxism from the 1990s. It was published by Sage Publications. It's useful for laying out the criterion that analytical Marxists have set for themselves and what they incorporated in. And there's a lot they brought in that wasn't just reframing Marxism beyond Hegel-infused language. Okay, back to this. B, his willingness to jettison aspects of Marxist empirical analysis that are in tension with the results of more recent social science. And C, his interest in normative dimensions of socialist thought. Following this, he quickly remarks that those who object to Cohen usually do so on the grounds that of C first, then B, then A, which seems to me quite accurate. The rejection by Cohen of the labor theory of value, Marx's understanding of exploitation, or Marx's critique of the prior political economist labor theory of value, which is Marx's understanding of exploitation, and things of that nature in favor of more recent social science is a very fruitful place to begin considering where the last section of the book left off. This is a rejection of the Althusser's aforementioned theory of heterodox science, but also, importantly, a rejection of the notion that Marxism constitutes its own field of social science at all. This recent social science is, in effect, going on somewhere else as part of a larger social division of labor. Marxist critics on one hand and actual scientists on the other. But, of course, we're not talking about the positivistic or our physical sciences. We are talking about social science. And if you look at what the analytic Marxists sneak in, to Vivek Chidber and Eric Olin Wright, to a lesser degree than some of the classical analytical Marxists like Perswalski, who uses game theory and rational Schwartz theory, Romer, who also sneaks in things like equilibrium economics, and methodological individualism. You can see all kinds of problems, not just in Cohen. That's what that Tom Mayer book is so useful for. And what you actually discover is some of what they sneak in is not any more empirically valid than anything Hegel came up with. Marxists should, according to the analytical Marxists, outsource their understanding of the real world to responsible academics doing neoclassical economics or post-structuralist history, and so on. I mean, they actually don't really so much support post-structuralist history, but nonetheless. Frankly, it's somewhat insulting to compare this sort of relationship to social sciences to that of Marx's in the reading room in the British Museum, as Burgess does. Marx painstakingly worked to verify and appraise every claim made by bourgeois political economists. And I don't say this lightly, but it's the thought that I keep coming to after being consistently confronted with Jacobin columnists' attempt to speak authoritatively on social science and history while making very obvious mistakes and oversight. Vivek Chibber's The Class Matrix, for example, claimed to defend the structuralist understanding of class, but seemed to have been written in a total ignorance of what structures or structuralism are. Okay, fair, Nico, but you gotta have to show the receipts on that. That's just an assertion without the receipts. I actually agree with you, Nico, but you gotta cite some things where he fucked that up. You can't just assert it and put it in a footnote. Let's see what's in the footnote. Yeah, it's just a citation, but he doesn't say what's wrong. All right, let's get back to this. Seth Ackerman, in his high-profile debate with Robert Brenner over the Revol Press, botched his empirical debunking because he hadn't fully read the paper he was citing as proof of changing depreciation rates. This he does have the receipts on. And that's a good article if you want to go read Nico, go after Seth Ackerman. I think Seth Ackerman makes a lot of mistakes, actually. And now we have this essay by Burgess, who, in writing on the necessity of revisiting the views in light of new evidence, appears to have taken an extremely naive epistemological position about social science, rarely checking the accuracy of claims, particularly those found in secondary sources which support his side in the debate. For example, in discussing the controversy over the transformation problem, Burgess states, quote, one concern leading to these economists away from Marxist orthodoxy had to do with the transformation problem that vexed Marx long before he came out with Capital Volume 1, which has continued to vex orthodox Marxist economists. How can we account for the extreme divergence? Indeed, it seems to many observers the lack of obvious relationship at all between the market price of commodities, which, remember, are supposed to be at least a distorted reflection of labor time value, and the average socially necessary labor time it takes to produce them. The trouble is that last sentence is totally misleading. There is no empirical divergence between market prices and labor times, as a number of studies establish a robust correlation between the two. They even have been the topic of a somewhat important debate between Andrew Kleinman and Paul Cockshott. There are arguments that these correlations are spurious, but it remains a fact that there is a correlation rather than some extreme divergence, and indeed, labor correlates better to prices than other common cost inputs to the production process, which I've actually seen that too. Similarly, Burgess goes on to cite Jacobin editor Mike Baggs for a rather incredulous claim that classical political economists had a totally foreign notion of supply and demand, such that we should put no stock in Marx's critique of supply and demand, the critique being that they only demand temporary divergence from an equilibrium price. There's no such thing as an equilibrium price. God, even logically, approaching an equilibrium price, as a non-Marxist economic philosopher Joseph Heath said, he's a Keynesian, that there's no reason to assume that approaching an equilibrium price is even possible or linearly established. And in fact, for it to be so, it would require the abolition of time, since you'd have to have near simultaneous understanding of all knowledge for the market to reach peak equilibrium. It's just not something that can happen. And I've actually talked about this because equilibrium pricing is brought up a lot in analytical Marxism without any proof that it actually is how things are priced. All right. Begg says, pointing to a quote from Marx, that classical political economists thought about supply and demand in terms of forces or quantities of goods and not schedules or curves, as us moderns do with our Fasci, Marshall, and Cross. It doesn't seem to occur to Begg that, one, these two descriptions are effectively equivalent, as classicals were quite capable of imagining hypothetical increases in supply versus demand and their effects on price. Yeah, just because you don't model it in the same way doesn't mean you don't understand it. You can do almost any math with any other math. It's not as efficient. All right. And two, the precursors to the Marshall and curve were already existed in Marx's time. And indeed, he was familiar with one such author who made these sorts of diagrams, Karl Heinrich Rau, who Engels attested Marx was not fond of. Proto-marginalists were also the source of some of Marx's most vicious asides in Capital, as is apparent to some who have read Marx's footnotes. Just as well, Marx has other equivalent statements on supply and demand that don't use the vocabulary of forces that Beggs makes so much of. He also uses the language of equilibrium and natural prices to indicate a deeper regulator of the market prices beyond temporary changes in supply and demand, an equivalent shift from short-term to longer-term in Marshallian language. Yeah, but it's just still not such thing as an equilibrium price. It is well known that long-term classical supply and demand analysis assume constant returns to scale, whereas the marginalists and Marshall assume declining returns to scale. And between the two, I find the classical assumptions to be more realistic when you allow for fixed capital investment, aka machines and other overhead, not labor. Instead, Begg seems to say declining returns to a scale which was always a commonsist assumption, and amidst the fact that this assumption of declining returns is required for demand to matter at all in the determination of long-term equilibrium prices. Which, again, as I pointed out, equilibrium prices are a bullshit concept. If we were to submit to his zombie Marx essay, which is a terrible essay, to any legitimate history of economic thought undergraduate course, Beggs would probably receive a D-. Now, Beggs' essay isn't all bad in other areas, and he makes some valid criticisms of Marxist economists like Harvey and Kleinman. But the essay is undermined by such a poor grasp of the facts. And so Burgess is undermined by not thinking to check the many claims he so neatly support his point of view. If we're speaking about updating views in light of new research, it's worth noting that one of the central conceits of the transformation problem was labor theory of value predicted that profit rates would be lower in capital-intensive industries, whereas Marx and everyone else assumed that it wasn't the case, that industry profit rates should effectively behave like bonds where the market will adjust to equalize the returns. But recent empirical research has shown that profit rates are actually lower in capital-intensive industries. Probably because fixed capital isn't fungible. See that about your AI problem and whether or not it's going to be profitable in the long run. And just can be ripped up, repurposed, and moved around to get an average return. So, of course, this doesn't conclusively empirically prove that labor theory of value. I mean, you probably can't. And I don't mean that as a criticism of labor theory of value. I mean, it's a conceptual rubric. You probably need an extremely detailed and accurate input-output tables for the whole economy to do that. Yep, and GDP isn't a good proxy for it, even though it's the closest thing we have. But I definitely feel that both Burgess and bourgeois social science are overplaying their hand in this critique of Marxist economics. So, too, is taking these economic concepts seriously generative in terms of the scientific research project, as the various works in the fields of classical econophysics have shown. An example, though, would have been better understand the consequences of the bad epistemic relationship to social science's role of European social democracy versus Soviet communism playing the world with Jacobin's brand of democratic socialism. In Burgess's praise of Cohen, he has the following topic of the USSR place in Marxist theory. Translating a point made by Cohen in the one extra chapter in the 2000 edition of Karl Marx's Theory of History in the language of the distinction made here, the fall of the Soviet Union, widely understood as a falsification of Marxism, was actually a vindication of at least the forces limiting relations component of the theory. Although the forces limited relations with no discussion of relations of production because forces emerge out of relations of production, not just subject to it, is one of the primary flaws of Cohen's basically Whiggish technologism. Where Marxists themselves would, of course, have preferred an economically viable and politically desirable version of socialism to emerge in the USSR, to the cold comfort of having our theory confirmed, a flourishing socialism emerging at such a low level of development of productive forces would have dramatically disconfirmed that theory. What was such a low level of productive forces in the Soviet Union by the 1980s? What are you on? And understanding this point is not only relevant to the rearguard debates with a few remaining Stalinists and Maoist dead-enders who think such leapfrogging would have been possible. I'm somewhat astounded at this claim. It's strange credulity to imagine the productive forces of 1917 would have had such causal power over events nearly a century later, even after some immense economic transformations in the history of the world, aka the mass nationalization and development of industry, whether you think it was state capitalist or not, in the USSR during the 1920s and 30s, which was, one of the fastest buildups of economic development we've seen ever. And it did involve some leapfrogging, but also internal developmentalism. Burgess here cites a book by Steve Paxton, one of Cohen's students, who gives a treatment of a post-Stalin USSR lasting only a handful of pages, and instead spends most of its time establishing that, indeed, capitalist social relations have barely taken hold in Russia by the time of the revolution, which is kind of true, but that's not here nor there. This is a vast implication of history, sort of looks like Marx's original theory if one's currents is not very comforting. On the other side, McManus draws from the European social democracy as the basis for contemporary democratic social strategy. From its failure, he says we should learn the lesson to build major civil society groups and democratization of the workplace through the rebuilding of the labor movement and entrenching its power more comprehensively. He further points to the Meitner plan as a model for the democratic transition away from capitalism. Essentially, McManus believes that social democracy was defeated by neoliberalism essentially because the working class civil society wasn't strong or entrenched enough. This is also Tribber's conclusion in the class matrix, which is weird because all these developmental forces of history people become weirdly voluntarist when you actually push them on the Nordic model, but totally completely determinist when talking about the Soviet Union. And I think it should be obvious that this is a problem because it's basically one paradigm for thee, but not for me. But nonetheless, I mean, on this section, I actually pretty much agree with Villareal here. This also is Chipper's conclusion in the class matrix and the point of departure for Ackerman's attempt to debunk the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. I think it's safe to say that this is more or less the official Jacobin line, but it doesn't simply hold up scrutiny. That this is the case becomes apparent in the final and I think most successful essay in the book, The Limits of Bourgeois Socialism. For all of Burgess and Cohen's emphasis on the forces of production, they never discuss the actual dynamics which determine these forces are given the scientific treatment, because Cohen doesn't either, because they don't deal with relations of production. If you don't deal with relations of production and you think they're subordinate for forces, you think the forces are basically Whiggish technological development, which they cannot be. That doesn't make any sense unless you believe in the extreme spirit or some weird liberal bullshit or animist bullshit. All right, anyway. Neither is there any updating of Marx's theory through the more recent innovations in social science, such as Kalecki's profit equations, which formalize the relationship between profits and investments. It's funny that analytical Marxists didn't actually even look at Keynesianism all that seriously. But anyway, I bring this up not as some trivia they should have been aware of, but to suggest how Jacobin writers might have anticipated some of the rather obvious points in the final essay, which they would nonetheless appear ignorant of. This essay, written by Ernesto Vargas, with contributions by Comrade Hamilton, dives into the economic and political history of Mexico in the 20th century as a case study. The study is somewhat familiar to me. I can place where an uncle was kidnapped and tortured by the ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party, the Party of the Revolution Institucional, the Parti Revolution Institucional, or the PRI, for being a communist in the 1970s, and other members of extended family belonging to the bourgeois middle class that Ernesto mentions towards the end of this history. Those who have benefited from the rapid economic development around Monterrey, San Antonio logistical corridor. I used to live in Torreon, which is near that, and it used to be part of it until the Zetas and Sinaloa cartel war kind of cut it off from that. Still, even in Monterrey, which has transformed quite dramatically the past 50 years, it is obvious that Mexico remains a developing country, or a semi-developed country, maybe, having more in common with places like Manila in its infrastructure and concentration of abject poverty than its counterparts north of the border. The economic story here is the rise and fall of Mexican state-directed capitalism and its import substitution schemes that accompanied it. A story which is all too familiar in the developing world of the 20th century, but which, in many ways, has its origins and more concise archetype in the United States of Mexico, which, by the way, is what Mexico is called. Wanting to break the whole of the foreign capital on the Mexican economy, while at the same time developing the nation's productive forces, successive governments pursued policies of domestic investment funded by government deficits while limiting exports. I mentioned the Kalecki profit equations earlier because they are useful here. Kalecki noted that profits were equal to capitalist consumption plus investment plus government deficits plus trade surplus. If we assume a fixed social working day and a rate of exploitation such that an overall surplus is the same, then increasing the investment has to come at the expense of some of these other categories. Usually it comes at the expense of capitalist consumption. So too must government deficits lead to a decreased capitalist consumption, all else equal. But luckily for the capitalists, there is one more variable that they can use to avoid sacrificing consumption, and that is trade surplus. If trade surplus turns into a deficit, then it can counteract some increases in either government deficits or investment. The import substitution schemes, however, prevent the solution as well as putting up obstacles to imports, which we might do here, by the way. These government policies, therefore, had two major consequences. One, they steadily increased government debt, and two, they steadily led to a decline of surplus available for capitalist consumption. For a variety of reasons, this debt becomes unsustainable, eventually leading to the various peso and debt crises. With the end of currency and import controls, the trade deficit exploded, so too were government deficits reined in, relaxing the pressure on capitalist consumption. A de facto neoliberalism, as Vargas put it, eventually set in. Unlike neoliberalism in the US and UK, Mexico seemingly didn't see any reduction in investment rates as a result, which we did, and so did the UK, and so did most of the Anglo world, actually. However, the end of bourgeois socialism, as Vargas calls it, does go to show a fundamental trade-off in economic development, the same one the Soviets faced in the question of primitive socialist accumulation. That is, the investment required for development must come from somewhere. You squeeze the domestic population, be that the capitalist workers or a third class like the peasants, as the Soviet did, let foreign capital use its own investment power and allow foreign capital to reap the surplus as a result, as most of the developed world does, or you can squeeze foreign capitalists through more competitive industries, as Chinese currently do. Outcompeting the leading countries is difficult, and at this point in global industrialization, it requires accumulated aggregation of many sophisticated technical capabilities, something that likely requires some combination of the first two investment strategies to work anyway if you were starting from scratch. And that's not even dealing with what Phil Meal talks about, the organic composition of capital and the fact that you can produce a lot more even at smaller profit rates by increasing fixed capital investments, aka automating shit. Which lowers your profit rates, but also lowers your need of employment, which means that the consumer boom associated with industrialization doesn't go as far the later in capitalism you develop. The early birds get the worm. In other words, if import substitution was ever going to work, it would have required a level of expropriation and direct state control of productive investment somewhere between Soviet high communism and post-collective China, which, the 80s. Although the capitalist class persists, still does, it is highly disciplined by the Chinese Communist Party and must abide by the states arbitrarily directing investment, although that has its limits, and they show up in declining GDP rates. The reason that Mexico lacked this ability to control or squeeze its domestic capitalist class to an extent sufficient enough to develop its productive forces was political. The same reason that Vargas speaks of bourgeois socialism. What Vargas takes pains to show is that this development project, while supported by working class civil society, was from beginning to end a project of the bourgeois ruling class, as represented by, Obregón and Carranza. Yeah, not great guys. The severe repression of the left by the Mexican government, and a nominally socialist government at that, in the 1960s and 70s is proof enough of this, just as the historical facts in regard to the pre's origin and functions. This bourgeois socialism is more or less equivalent to the sort of politics found all across the Fordist period in the West of social democracy and the U.S. New Deal, and was just as common elsewhere in the developing world. The problem of bourgeois socialism is, even if it causes the capitalist class to sacrifice some consumption to develop productive forces, it will never be able to force any sacrifice which could existentially threaten the existence of a domestic capitalist class. And that's true even in other places that people call socialists. While this essay arguments are perhaps too tinged by unequal exchange theorists, emphasis on the role of wages and development for my taste, Lots of Semiramin and Vargas's argument. They're not too far from the mark in pointing out the problem of political power of this capitalist class. I think if Vargas and Hamilton are too essentialist and pessimistic on the nature of Western developed countries and the possibility of political change there, they nonetheless hit on an essential insight that eludes Burgess and McManus. If the history of Mexico in the 20th century has taught us anything, it is that bourgeois socialism is not adequate to achieve development goals, which is why the developing world can only ever seem to get quasi-developed no matter how strong they get, that the forces of authentic socialism must be capable of organizing themselves as well as seizing power. The Jacobin ideology rests more or less on the assumption that we in the developed countries are in this same vulgar logic of development of productive forces. Actually, the Jacobin social democrats aren't even the only people who assume it. A lot of Marxist-Leninists assume it now too, and particularly weird deviations, not deviants, I don't know anything about their practices, like the MAGA communists, who basically are arguing for developmentalism in the most developed parts of the world. Anyway, what Lenin ridiculed as deindustrializing playground of U.S. millionaires and any situation of continental Europe, past or present. We, those of us in the U.S., have allowed investment rates to decline significantly and our productive forces to atrophy in order to cater to capitalist consumption, often manifest in wealth transfers and stock buying and other forms of fictitious capital generation. While resting our currency's role in the global circulation of capital to extract surplus, a role that itself, more or less, rests on a relatively degrading military superpower status. See the decline of the dollar right now. It's declined 10% this year. For the Jacobin authors, the productive forces essentially enter into the equation only as the most abstracted formulations of Marx, a gestalt portrait of history rather than any economic reality that can be determined by quantifiable economic activity. Hence why, in the rate of profit debates, they must forswear any possible contradiction between development of productive forces and social democratic politics, which, is dumb. In this way, Vargas is the only author in this collection that I believe comes close to affirming Marxism as a science, by example, if not as a theoretical justification, aka Vargas is a good historian. That's what I would say. Vargas is probably the best historian of the bunch, not a theorist or a philosopher or a historian of ideas. For the generation that encountered socialism at first in the mid-2010s, the Jacobin crowd, despite any complaints we had, represented the adults in the room. They represented a level of competency in both organizing and theoretical rigor, which seemed to be a step above the other factions of the left, mostly who were obscured in sectarian milieus. That, however, no longer feels true, even if it's the result of a younger generation solely accumulating their own theological knowledge. This is the other key aspect of maintaining Marxism as a science, which is the dual responsibility that science places on the individual to educate oneself and to challenge existing orthodoxies, to test and practice the famous standard of refutability. Okay. Refutability is better than falsifiability, and I know this is going to seem like me being semantic, but you can refute something by saying something is highly improbable, but you cannot falsify it, because falsification would require that there are no ways in which there's a percentage of a chance that it is true, where refutability would allow for a percentage of a chance that it is true, and we would have to modify our assumptions and some kind of null hypothesis. I say this because I actually think Nico is using these interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. It's a very subtle distinction, but one that really matters in philosophy of science. Now, I know most scientists don't give a shit about philosophy of science, but it's kind of like how most rhetoricians don't give a shit about linguistic history. It's still important to know if you're going to deal with the way rhetoric's been used and developed. And I use that because that's really my specialty. Anyway, just to say I agree with Nico more at the end here than I did at the beginning, because this framing is actually more subtle. He might not even have noticed the difference. Maybe he did. I don't know. I need to talk to Nico about it. This responsibility demands that we not relax our epistemic standards even for a moment, although science is not just about epistemic standards. You have to have them, but that's not the only thing. That we must check the footnotes, which no one fucking does anymore. Do the background research on our own claims, which is actually hampered by the specialization in education, which is one of the reasons why I talk about decadence. You know how many specialists only cite the people in their field, and the people of their field are using paradigms from other fields that they're not checking or even knowing that they're using correctly? I can tell you a bunch of PhDs who've been discouraged from actually checking the references beyond their own specific field notes for primary sources used in a secondary way. Ooh. And refuse to accept any claim that would read at face value, even if we happen to agree with it. Yeah, this is me. I'm willing to bet that all Marxism is false. I don't think it is. I would hope that such people as the author are given an argument, logic for the left, would agree with this notion of new rigor. I actually think Ben does, but not in the way that Nico would want him to. Keeping the flower alive. For Flower for Marx's introduction, Daniel Tutt provides an elegant description of the role that public reason and the fight against censorship played in the intellectual development of young Marx. I've already talked about why that's important. In the stunted liberalism of the Prussian state, Marx realized that public reason would fail under the conditions of censorship. Tutt points out that this argument applies just as well to the more diffuse censorship that occurs on the left, or in general society today. I would just add that. Many of the authors here pride themselves on opposing this censorship, deplatforming and canceling, etc., and wish to claim the mantle of public reason on the left, but not so fast. There remains a more subtle yet deeply entrenched historical censorship on the left, represented by these two camps. On one side, deference pays to the authority of bourgeois science as the only science, or bourgeois social science as a science at all. And on the other, the deference to authority of the party in controlling theoretical practice. Yeah. Ouch. This epistemic deference is no small thing, even if it seems small compared to the petty tyrannies of censorship we experience today, for it will be the basis for any form of debate on the left is unchallenged. Believe it, if we're not fighting on the realm of science, we're fighting on the realm of force. That's just a fact, and I hate to tell you that. I think it's worth quoting Rosa Luxemburg from her constructive criticism of the Russian Revolution. Freedom is always an exclusive freedom for one who thinks differently. I mean, liberals say that shit too, but it's not wrong. Not because of any fanatical concept of justice. Thank you, Rosa, because justice, blah, but because all of it is instructive, wholesome, and purifying in the political freedom that depends on the social characteristic, and its effectiveness vanishes when freedom becomes a special privilege. This freedom is also the essence of any science, for it's when Marxism loses its ability to articulate dissent, whether it's expert authority of bourgeois social scientists or the central authority of party or any other authority, that flower withers and the weeds of dogmatism rise. Or to talk about the Lakatosian sense and the programmatic sense, the political program becomes impossible because the research program that undergirds it makes no sense. The words aren't agreed upon, they're not communicative, the concept's inflated, and no one even knows what they're talking about. Which is why I do all these things like talking about the different theories of imperialism, because people use them interchangeably without realizing they're even doing so. Thank you, Nico. Well, I still take minor exceptions to part of this essay, and I'm not totally convinced on econophysics, although I do think there's some econophysics modeling that does impress me. I think relations of production are underutilized in analytical Marxism, and what analytical Marxism takes in, even though I am also a user of game theory and stuff for figuring out short-term political outcomes, I would never use it to figure out the possibility of long-term historical development, because long-term historical development is not a singular game. It is way more of a complex system than that. And that, good night, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. You can find more behind the Patreon wall, although, not a ton more. I should tell this better. You can find a ton more. There actually is like 2,000 episodes of various things behind the Patreon wall. There's like 350 something free podcasts, and I don't even know, like 700 free shows. If you want to support my work and find more of it, there's more than you can probably ever consume. Unless you just listen to me straight, which would be weird. You need to listen to other people. You can look at my Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, I'll go commenting on the podcast, the interview podcast, on anything you listen to. All those things help me, and I'd appreciate it. I'd like to thank Nico for contributing this debate, and I await his response to my admittedly minor criticisms. Good day, and protect all your pieces. That sounds weird. Protect your peace.